with my good friend Sitch and my
Hey
good friend
now!
and my good friend Douglas, who has a channel called the MMT Trader. I watched this video, and this video was pretty interesting, and I sent it to Doug, and I asked Doug to come on and respond to it. I think oil is going to be a big conversation with the situation going on in Iran. And obviously, I have a kind of a different take on the monetary system. Doug, he calls his channel MMT Trader, so he's definitely a guy who knows MMT. So obviously, MMT is very controversial, but I just thought it'd be interesting to discuss it, get Doug's feedback on this video, and just basically have a little casual stream. You want to introduce yourself, Doug, or you want to say anything?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here. Second time. So excited to enlighten the viewers on some MMT. I had all positive comments last time about MMT, so it was great.
Our channel hates MMT, but whatever.
Not a single dissent at all. But let's get into the video. Excited to.
Well, before we get into this, okay. So for the lay people like me, all right, what is this? What are we learning? What are we talking about today, Adam? We're talking about the petrodollar. We hear about that a lot, right?
Well, this came up on a live
money.
stream. Yeah, and you had some good questions for me about the petrodollar, which made me think about it. I mean, my stance on the petrodollar is it's a myth. But then you asked me, well, what is exactly a myth about it, which kind of made me think, yes, what really is the petrodollar myth? And I think the petrodollar myth for me comes down to this idea that if countries start trading oil, like buying oil. China wants to buy oil from Iran, and they want to buy that oil in yuan, Chinese yuan. If they don't do the transaction in American dollars, that somehow the entire American economy is going to implode. This is going to be the death of America. I think that's what the petrodollar myth is. I think people do settle their transactions in dollars because dollars is like the best platform, the most stable platform to do it. And if they did stop doing it, there would be some ramifications, but it wouldn't be the apocalypse. So what do you think of that explanation, Douglas? And what is your take on the petrodollar?
Yeah, man, you just nailed it. I'm good here. I'm checking out. You've explained it all. I mean that's exactly what it is. At the end of the day, if two parties settle something with a currency, that's not necessarily what ultimately is going to drive the use of that currency. I mean, we're going to get into it when we get into the video, but I mean, really what it all boils down to is, okay, if a contract in oil settles in dollars, someone's going to receive those dollars. That's a correct thing that happens mechanically. The question is, the person who has those dollars, what are they going to do with those dollars? Why are they going to do it with those dollars? And then, what is the implication of that? And so everyone understands that contracts settle in dollars, oil contracts settle in dollars, but that's you got to think through step 2, step 3, step 4 in terms of what ultimately happens. And so there is a part to what he's going to say, and I do kind of agree that the dollar is under attack for certain reasons, but he never actually gets to those reasons. He gets close, but the conclusion could be correct. Definitely not the petrodollar system causing it. And I think this video is a great video to actually set up exactly what you're saying. Is there is a myth there. And he's going to continue to, kind of hit home at that, what I see as the myth. And I think at a couple different angles we can get at this and get people at the very least thinking. I mean, maybe you're going to walk away disagreeing, whatever, but certainly we'll get you a different perspective on this.
Yeah, we're going to highlight the differences between the two paradigms. I do like ClearValue Tax. I like this guy's videos. I watch his videos regularly. I do think he's got solid investment advice and good financial advice in general. I think I disagree with him on his understanding of the monetary system. I think that's where, but look, I can enjoy a guy's content and still disagree with him. So I don't want you to think
you're not allowed to.
I don't want you to think I'm hating on this guy.
Drop a hate comment.
Right.
No, wait. So, okay, hold on. So the argument is just for us people out there. Okay. The argument is that whenever a country has to buy oil from some Middle Eastern country or some other country, that country usually only accepts US dollars, right? So the buying country has to change their currency. So like if Japan they have to switch out their yen for dollars to buy the oil because, Saudi Arabia doesn't want yen, they want dollars. And then the argument is if that goes away, like, for example, if instead Saudi Arabia accepts, the yuan, the Chinese first avatar, instead of the American dollar, then this is going to hurt America because demand for dollars will go down, right? That is the argument.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. That there's this demand impulse that is pushing the dollar up. And there is a demand impulse that has actually propped up the dollar. We'll talk about what that is. But their argument, the petrodollar, steelman the petrodollar argument here, the collapse of the petrodollar, is that a lot of that demand has come from the reality that contracts in oil settle in dollars. If you're needing oil to produce something and you want to buy oil from an oil producer on the spot market, you're going to, those contracts are going to settle in dollars, right? It's WTI divided by dollars. It's Brent divided by dollars. It's going to settle in dollars. And so when you go to do that, if you don't have, if you're you're in the UK or something like that, and all you have is pounds, you've got to now go sell your pounds to buy dollars. So that's upward pressure on the dollar. And they're saying that upward pressure is what's propped up the dollar and created this exorbitant benefit for the U.S. That's what they're saying, right? Gotcha. It's this constant need to go sell your currency to buy dollars.
Right.
What we're going to point out, just to kind of set the stage here, just to kind of undermine this, that then means that whoever if you're the UK, you sold your pounds to buy the dollars, you sold the dollars to the producer of the oil, who right now that oil producer now has dollars, but they still have a decision to make, right? And I think that's where this entire argument needs to be brought forth a little bit further, is they still have a decision to make. Again, we'll get there, but the petrodollar argument is
what to do with their dollars once they have them.
Yeah. The petrodollar argument is nope, just that first step of having to sell your currency to buy the dollar to settle the contract is this exorbitant privilege. And when it goes away, the U.S. In its power is going to go away. And again, I'm actually going to land to a similar conclusion as who we're going to watch, but it has nothing to do that the petrodollar in and of itself is not necessarily if the U.S. wants its exorbitant privilege of the dollar. And we can even get into what that exorbitant privilege really is in more detail. But if we want to keep that, and it's a policy choice, I mean, at this point, it's pretty much a policy choice. We want to keep that. Then the policy decision would have to be different, and we shouldn't necessarily look to just keep the petrodollar per se.
All right, cool.
So
all right,
so the intro here is very interesting because while a lot of people crap on MMT, the perspective he gives here in the very beginning of the video is exactly the same perspective that Warren Mosler gives. So this guy basically agrees with part of the tenets of MMT, specifically what drives demand for a currency. So, and he's going to lay out an example here that's a perfect example. So let's get into it.
I want to begin today's video by explaining to you what de-dollarization is. And for that, I brought a prop. Do you know what this is? It's a fuzzy pen. So what's this valued at? Let's just say it's worth $5. Maybe you can get it for $3, maybe you can get it for $10, but let's just go at $5. Okay, but what if the US government told all the producers and manufacturers of these fuzzy pens that you have to stop making these because the US government is now going to be the sole producer of these? And the government also tells you, me, all Americans, that we must obtain these fuzzy pens, and failure to do so will result in you going to prison. So in that scenario, what's going to happen to the value of these fuzzy pens? The value is going to shoot up because there's going to be much more demand for these fuzzy pens, right? That makes sense. Okay.
So he lays out artificial demand perfectly here. So the thing that creates demand for dollars is the fact that if you don't pay your taxes in dollars, someone's going to show up and take your home away from you or arrest you. So when people talk about, the collapse of the dollar, people just will magically stop wanting to use dollars. You can always default to this fuzzy pen argument. Oh, how will they do that? How will the dollar collapse when you have a complete state apparatus set up around forcing you to use dollars, basically creating artificial demand for dollars?
Yeah, this is part of the MMT 101, the foundation of MMT, which is what drives the use of a currency. And and you can even kind of broaden this out, but I mean, let's just go to this idea. Obviously, in a fiat currency system, so by fiat, I just mean the dollar's not backed by anything. I can't take my dollars to a central bank and say, hey, give me gold or something like that, right? The only real value of them, the first, the kind of first order value is I've got a tax bill and I've got to pay the tax, right?
Yeah.
And so that might not in and of itself drive the value, but it definitely drives what he would call the intrinsic value of it, right? So the intrinsic value is I don't want the government coming after me to confiscate my wealth to offset or do damage to me to offset the fact that I didn't pay this tax, and that's really kind of the first step in establishing a demand. And immediately too, I am seeing Zimbabwe and other countries who have runaway currencies, and this is just an interesting thing to think about right now through the lens of the tax, right? In countries that end up with hyperinflation. It's one thing that they all very much have in common, or quite often can have in common, is hyperinflation will absolutely happen if the currency is no longer going to be able to settle the tax, or whatever that tax looks like, right? And that is absolutely one way that you can get yourself into a hyperinflationary scenario. Not the only way, but certainly one way to get in that pathway. And I think Zimbabwe also actually started to accept currency outside, started actually accepting dollars to settle tax, right? Well, why would you want a Zimbabwe currency? Why would you work for a Zimbabwe currency if the dollar can do exactly what, I don't know what they call their currency, if it can do the exact same thing? So this tax thing is really, really important. We oftentimes forget it, but he's absolutely right. This very much underpins a fiat currency system. And you might not like there might be a reason to not have a fiat currency system. We can go down that rabbit trail and debate it and say maybe there's, maybe we want government to step in and say fiat plus backed by gold, right? So you're a proponent of big government coming in, adding more layers to the argument. You're an Austrian economist and say, no, we also want gold backed on top of just pure fiat, right? We want the government to have to confiscate real wealth like gold to then be able to spend, right? So that's what we would want. And you can make that argument, and whether or not I agree with that argument or not is moot to the point that at the end of the day, in the current system as is, we settle our tax bill, and then ultimately, based on that, the entire capitalist system grows, where we're going to settle our contracts in this dollar. Why? Because every business has to pay taxes in dollars. A business could. There's nothing stopping a business from saying, "Hey, I'm actually going to accept Bitcoin for this transaction, or I'm going to accept gold for this transaction." Right? You're running the stream. Someone could donate something of physical to you, as opposed to whatever the super chat is, or whatever it is on YouTube. That's purely dollars, right? But the reason we all operate in dollars is you still need to get those dollars to pay the tax. And so if you just kind of continue to think through that logic, you'll understand that this tax idea is important.
I don't like it when people are afraid that the value of the dollar is going to collapse because everybody just decides one day, I've lost all faith in the dollar. Like there's a pressure there that you have to ignore to be able to say that. So I think he gets more into it here too. Which is good.
You will.
It's the same thing with this. What is this? This is just cotton and linen. You can call this a piece of paper. What's the intrinsic value of this? It's zero. It's nothing. This is just cotton and linen. It's a fiat currency backed by nothing.
See, I like he's baller too. He pulls out $100 bill. He doesn't pull out a $1. He's like, look, I'm rolling in it.
But why is this so valuable? It's because there's so much demand for this. Okay, why? Because if you don't obtain this, you're either going to end up in prison or you're going to end up in the streets. Okay, so what am I talking about? Going to prison. Have you heard of Wesley Snipes? Like, you don't pay your taxes, you're going to end up in prison or in jail. I mean, you don't pay your property taxes with these, what's going to happen? They're going to take away your home. You don't pay your auto loan with these, what's going to happen? They're going to take away your vehicle. So ultimately what's going on is that US dollars have value because there's big demand for US dollars. Now, I want to bring this to your attention. If you want to buy oil in the Mideast, then you need to buy it with dollars. It's the petrodollar system, and that creates big demand for US dollars. Governments and central banks, they want to store their savings, they want to store their reserves in US dollars as well, and that creates big demand for dollars as well. But what if oil started to be sold in other currencies outside of the dollar? What if governments and central banks didn't want to save or hold their reserves in dollars? Then there would be much less demand for dollars. And if there's less demand for dollars, then the value of the dollar will fall. And if the value of the dollar falls, then it's going to require more devalued dollars to buy anything because they're going to be worth less because there's less demand for them. And then what's going to happen? Well, in that case, inflation's going to go up, interest rates are going to go up, and I guarantee you that average wages for Americans are not going to keep up, and the standard of living for Americans will go down. And this is occurring right now in plain sight, and the majority of Americans are clueless. Here's what you need to know. Right now, countries around the world are actively trying to move away from the US dollar, which means less demand for dollars. This process is called de-dollarization, and I want you to know that it's a process. It's not an event. Okay, why should you care? You have to understand that the value of the dollar doesn't just affect the US government. The value of the dollar affects all Americans through inflation, interest rates, your investments, and of course the cost of living. If the dollar weakens, then all of that's going to become worse. So most Americans take this privilege of a strong dollar for granted. Unfortunately, again, this privilege is being stripped from us right under our noses just little by little. And as time goes on and countries de-dollarize, even more, most Americans will become noticeably poorer. So there's actually a way to protect yourself and your family from de-dollarization, which I'm going to be happy to share with you in this video. And I just want to say that, okay, if you don't want to take my advice, then fine, be my guest. All I can tell you is, well, in that case, if you want to be stubborn like that, I'll just say have fun in the future being stressed about money constantly and being miserable and having a bad attitude and watching life just pass you by. Because you did nothing to defend yourself against the government's plan of financial slavery. Now, I want to show you this. Foreign central banks hold U.S. treasuries in their reserves. You can think of these, essentially as dollars because it's a huge component of the dollar ecosystem. As of early 2026, gold has overtaken U.S. treasuries as the world's largest central bank reserve asset for the first time in 30 years, marking a historic shift.
You want to comment on just if the world stops using less dollars are in circulation? My thinking is sooner or later we're going to shrink the money supply to accommodate that fewer dollars are in demand overseas, but that's not really going to affect inflation for us because obviously if you shrink the money supply, you're counterbalancing whatever inflation might be taken in for less demand.
Yeah, he made a lot of points there. Let's where I want to start is kind of with this idea of what happens if the dollar falls, and then go back to some of the mechanics because he pushes two things together, and they shouldn't be with the mechanics, and that's going to be really important for the discussion and why the petrodollar. But
before you get into it, just the dollar falling. What is the concept of that? That's next to other currencies, right? When you're talking about the dollar falling, you're only talking about it in the context of compared to other currencies. So it really only affects imports if you're buying something from another country.
Exactly.
So domestic products have nothing to do with it. If the value of the dollar falls, as they say, you're not talking about domestic products. Yeah.
Unless the domestic product has some sort of contingent manufacturing process where they have to import a lot. But yes, domestically, you're right. And this is a big thing. If the value of the dollar drops, now, I don't know about your house, but everything in my house, every appliance, my clothes, pretty much everything, my cars, pretty much everything is not from America, right? My food is, but I think I have a Korean a Korean stove and a Chinese refrigerator, right, or whatever, a Japanese car, that sort of thing. And so in that instance, if the dollar drops in real terms, it now just costs more dollars for me to get a Toyota. Right. And that is absolutely true. And the privilege that the U.S. has had is for the last, really going over 50 years now, but certainly since the post-Great Financial Crisis period, and there's reasons for this, the U.S. has had a very strong dollar and a ton of power for importing. Right, our real cost of living is low as it's ever been. Right, the amount of, maybe the best way to put it is the amount of time it takes you to work to fully furnish a home. Let's just say something like that. Right, get all the appliances, get the couch, get the TVs. It's as low as it's ever been, right? Or
to
close
buy
to,
the home,
right?
on the other hand, it's as high,
exactly.
it's higher than it's ever been.
Exactly. Yes, yeah, and it's the paradox of importing versus, right? We can't import a house, but to furnish it specifically. So, the ability to import cheaply in real terms for us, right? To be able to work, half a day and be able to get a new appliance and in your wage terms or whatever, right? That is because the rest of the world has up to this point, up to a year ago, wanted to export to the U.S., right? Now, if the rest of the world doesn't want to do that, and they're not, and the way that they do that, the way that they make it so easy for the U.S. to want to import is they're going to suppress their own currency. And there's a mechanism on how they do this, but they're going to want to suppress their own currency so the U.S. dollar becomes super valuable, and then all of a sudden it's very easy to buy the products that they want to export. So in that sense, if it reverses and the dollar starts pushing lower for reasons that we'll get into, our real wealth, what we can actually buy in real terms, will decrease, and that will eventually start showing up as inflation, and the cost of the goods that we're importing start pushing higher, if that were to happen. So that part of the argument is correct, right? That if the dollar really starts to collapse, and if the dollar starts to collapse and we don't manufacture domestically, that becomes problematic.
But this is why Trump wants the dollar to collapse, is so that we do force domestic manufacturing, correct?
Yeah.
That's the policy change.
Correct. So we can hang out here for a second. I thoroughly believe in capitalist theory. I think the profit motive is the reason that the private sector wants to grow. And what I mean by that is, you would start a business, I would start a business to create the fluffy pens that he had. Why? Because I think I can make a profit off of this, right? And at the macro level now, so I'm talking the entire macro space at the highest level, in order for the entire system to make a profit, that profit has to be added into the system from the outside. If I'm talking in the entire private sector, if you sell the fluffy pen and I'm the buyer of the fluffy pen and no new money is created, your profit, right? That exchange, your profit is now my loss, right? Now, the business sector is profitable in that instance, but at the entire private sector, including the consumer, it was just a balance sheet exchange that occurred, the real asset for the dollar. Now, where this comes in terms of Trump wanting the manufacturing boom, you can't just lower the value of the dollar and assume that that's going to make domestic manufacturing more profitable. You have to add those profits as an incentive. And you can do that through one of two ways. You can do that through just direct spending into the private sector, right? You can just simply say, hey, Toyota, start making cars in America, and we're going to pay the bill to build the factory. Or Tesla, we're going to foot the bill to build the factory. Or you can just give massive tax incentives, right? Mm-hmm. If you sell a car and you make X amount of revenue on that, we're not going to charge any taxes on it, right? And so that'll increase the profit. So now all of a sudden there's this profit motive that is occurring where you're like, oh wow, I'm going to make profit, and so now I can take a bigger risk and take on loans and take on debt to expand my manufacturing, and that is actually what builds the private sector up. And in part, that's why the U.S. has been what it is relative to the rest of the world, relative to the developed economies throughout the world. We've spent more on the fiscal side than any other country or bloc, right? It's not even close. Over the last 20 years, we've just outspent everyone, and because of that, one, we've had people wanting to export to us an exorbitant privilege, and two, we just grew more. Obviously, a lot of that just goes into asset price inflation, but regardless, we've had a better economy than the rest of the world in part because of that. So where I think Trump just misstepped is this idea that just by lowering the dollar through, he thinks tariffs are going to pull this off, is somehow going to encourage manufacturing. Well, no, I'm not going to manufacture anything if the profit motive that's there is under attack, right? The ability to make profits is under attack. And tariffs are attacks. Tariffs reduce profits. They don't increase profits. So yeah, you're going to get an offset on the dollar pushing lower, but you're going to end up just paying more in taxes, and in net, profits will just start slowing down. And profits are a direct, I mean, in the investment function, the input to it is just profits, right? I decide to invest because I'm profitable.
Right. All right, we can.
So central banks now hold roughly $4 trillion in gold, surpassing the $3.9 trillion held in U.S. treasuries. So do you see what's happening? Demand that was previously going towards dollars and U.S. treasuries are now shifting towards gold. Okay, a very good question is, why is this happening? Why do central banks want to hold fewer U.S. treasuries or dollars? In other words, diversify away from the dollar. I'll tell you it's for many reasons, but I'll give you the top reason. So the first one is the weaponization of the US dollar. 2, fiscal irresponsibility by the US government. And 3, money printing by the Federal Reserve. Now, let me share with you how the weaponization of the US dollar is incentivizing other countries to move away from the US dollar. One of the biggest turning points in this entire conversation happened back in 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies imposed massive sanctions on Russia. And one of the most significant actions was this. The United States of America and allies froze a large portion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's money. So like these reserves were, of course they belong to Russia, but they were held in Western financial institutions, including dollar-denominated assets. And once those reserves were frozen, Russia effectively lost access to them. Now, from a policy standpoint, this was meant to apply economic pressure on Russia, right? But from a global perspective, this sent a very clear message to other countries. And the message was, if your assets are held in dollars, then they can be frozen. So it's actually a big risk for other countries and central banks to trust in the dollar, because if they don't submit to the US, then their dollars can be confiscated with a simple just keystroke. Now, let's talk about the fiscal irresponsibility of the US government and the massive amount of money printing by the Federal Reserve.
So I agree with this first point. The sanctions is probably a big reason why Russia wants to not use United States dollars as much as possible. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. A couple thoughts on this, though. At the end of the day, the U.S., the West, has been able to create just this massive force of capitalism that we have for really, hundreds of years. But in part because we have had up to this point the highest standard of law and application of that law at the business level, and to sit here and say that like the U.S. not wanting to do business or allow business to happen through bad actors is somehow a net negative. Like, yeah, I'm sure Russia wants to get out of this system. I'm sure China wants to get out of the system. But I would say, just as a general principle, having a country that is, quote unquote, weaponizing their currency, as he puts it, but making sure that that they are consistently expressing what is just within the financial system is not a net bad. Again, you might end up taking a hit for it because Russia, China, India, some of them are not going to want to continue to play ball due to the risk. But I don't necessarily see it as on a policy standpoint necessarily a bad thing. What do you mind if I take one step back, make your point? But I did want to hit on one more thing. It's going to be important.
If we're purging bad actors from the monetary system, that would seem like a positive, not a negative. That's basically the argument you're making, right?
Yeah, it might not. I agree. It might push the dollar lower because there are people now who don't want to save in dollars. I don't disagree with that point, right? But for every person that's like, okay, I'm out of this system because at the end of the day, I want to do nefarious things, someone else is going to say, yeah, well, this system's far more trustworthy now. And I know if I enter... I know if I enter into a bad business deal and someone tries to scam me, that the legal system's going to have my back here and I can be made right. Right. And that is, I mean, that's why the U.S. has done what they've done. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not like sitting here trying to say that the U.S. hasn't done a lot of terrible things, but I'm just saying as a matter of principle, for every person that says I'm out of here to do nefarious things, that means there's one more person that's now like, yeah, good, I'm not going to be screwed over. And there will be some support here for me to want to do this.
Right. So what other point did you want to make?
Yeah, I want to step back. One of the points he made, and this is really kind of where he, I think, screws up in his own thinking here, and just where Chat and the rest of things should start thinking through, particularly with the petrodollar. You don't need to save to buy oil in dollars. You don't need to save in dollars to accomplish that task, right? If you're China, you're any country, you have yuan. When you go to settle that contract, you would just sell yuan, right? You can save in yuan and just sell it for dollars. When you do that, in the moment, the dollar will push higher. There's a bid there, the dollar's pushing higher, you need to settle this contract, right? Never did you need to save, because he's going to continue to talk about savings in treasuries diminishing, which is true. It is happening. There's reason for this. But the point is, once that transaction takes place, now let's say you sold it to the Saudis or something like that. They have dollars. They have a decision to make. Now, they might not want to save in dollars, right? They've chose to for reasons. The world has chose to for reasons. But they might choose, nope, I don't want to. I'm going to sell this right back into the market. Well, that exact pressure that pushed the dollar up has now pushed the dollar right back down. The transaction took place without the dollar having to move beyond the up and down that occurred to facilitate the transaction. The question is, who saves in the dollars and why do they save in the dollars? That is the question that you have to answer. And that is actually what answers why we've been seeing treasury holdings fall. That'll answer why after the tariff, after Liberation Day, the dollar started to collapse. You saved, the rest of the world outside the U.S. saves in dollars because their central banks want to suppress their currency to incentivize U.S. consumers to import their exports. That is all there is to it. So instead of
how's that work? How's the technical process of that?
If the Chinese yuan starts getting too high, and you can see it has, I mean, it's been on its longest tear in quite some time.
Right.
If it starts getting too high, the central bank was at one point like 4 trillion or something like that in treasuries. They're going to sell those treasuries, and he's right, the treasury and the dollar essentially interchangeable. They're going to sell those treasuries, and what ends up happening when they do that, they're flooding the market with dollars. The yuan, the dollar. The dollar in this instance would push lower, the yuan pushes higher, and if they want that to go the other way, then they'll hoard the dollars, they'll buy the dollars, and they'll keep them, and they'll export to the U.S. to then get the dollars to push higher, and they'll hoard the dollars at that point. So they're using their monetary operations to control really what used to be their peg to the dollar was.
And that's to lower the price of the imports for Americans to incentivize Americans to buy those imports.
Yes. Yep. Or they'll print their own money or whatever to get the yuan to push back lower. And they're going to do this. The only way they can manage this is by holding tons of reserves in dollars. And then the question you got to ask yourself is, okay, so China sells me, some tires, a laptop, whatever.
Yeah.
They've got
what do they do with
1,000
those dollars?
Yeah, and they can invest that in anything they want.
Buy
right?
stocks.
They could buy stocks. They could do whatever. I mean, and some central banks have started to do this.
Housing.
Right over in Europe, central banks have started to buy U.S. stocks. They was it Norway or something like that is a massive holder of like Apple or something. Yeah. So sovereign wealth funds have started to do this, but the vast majority of the world has said, okay, I want something that has a return, and I want it to be very safe. So I'm going to buy treasuries, and so that's why their holdings are there. So there's a difference there. And then when someone comes along and says, a policymaker comes along and says, hey, I don't like this idea that we're continuing to import everything. I'm going to put tariffs on things. Well, the rest of the world is like, okay, it's no longer a benefit for me. That they're signaling they're not going to consume my exports at this point in time, right? And why should I manage policy to do that anymore, right? Why should I manage policy?
So the tariffs basically, yeah.
Yeah, the tariffs are actually the explainer to what we're seeing with the dollar pushing lower, right?
And they're saying we need to stop manipulating our currency because, like, the whole process became unaffordable as soon as the tariffs stepped in.
Yeah, or I just don't. we signaled on Liberation Day, the U.S., that we don't actually want to buy your cheap goods anymore, right? We literally told them, hey, we want this to switch, right? The rest of the world, they all work in manufacturing, right? They build everything for Americans. We get to live stream and play golf and crap like that. And they've said, yeah, we want to support your lifestyle by selling you cheap stuff so you can stream and golf and have fun all day. We're going to work in the we're going to work in the manufacturing,
right? Yeah.
And we're going to build the stuff. And on Liberation Day, the U.S. said, nope. Hey, we want to flip that. We want to start going into the factories and building the stuff. We want our dollar to be lower so we can incentivize exporting our goods to the rest of the world. And we want you to have to stop working in the factories. And that's and then in real terms, our lives have been relatively good because we've been able to get the cheap crap, right? I mean, it used to be if you won a war, the country you beat would have to export everything they made to you, right?
Right.
And the world just voluntarily did this for 50 years, right? We didn't have to beat anyone to do this. They just voluntarily said, yeah, hey, we like what we got here. We'll work. We have jobs. You guys get cheap stuff. And it's a system. And, undoubtedly there were losers in that system, even domestically in the U.S., right? I'm not trying to say there aren't, segments of the population that got absolutely crippled because of that. However, it was a real benefit because we just got cheaper stuff. And a couple years ago, we voted to flip that.
Well, I just also why would you want to save in dollars? I think people believe that the United States is going to be around in 100 years. I'm not sure people have the faith that Russia, as it exists now, is going to be around in 100 years. So if you're thinking about saving in a Russian currency, that's always at the back of someone's mind, right?
100%. That would absolutely be something that's if you think a country is about to go under for some reason, that is exactly how the currency goes into hyperinflation. Yeah. Because no one wants to hold it. The minute you get it, you want to sell it. And that is definitionally just hyperinflation. And you're absolutely right. A country that has a stable legal system, has a stable foundation politically, all those sorts of things, that is absolutely going to prop up the value of the underlying currency. You start taking those things away, then you start seeing currencies push lower. Yeah.
And if people did, if there was this decoupling from the world, which a lot of people are frankly in favor of, then it would not mean the collapse of the United States dollar. I mean, it would change the calculus on all of these imports, on all of these cheap imports, but we would adapt.
We would, yeah. I mean, we would have to. I mean, yeah.
You sound like it might be a struggle. You sound like it might be.
Oh yeah, go. We're going to find out real quick. I bet by the end of this year, the tariff policy and everything was just a really bad idea. I don't think we're going into recession, but what's absolutely going to happen is if your refrigerator broke, you just bought a new one. They weren't that expensive, right? I mean, I'm married, got a wife, got 4 kids. Telling my wife, hey, we just got to keep repairing the broken appliance because the new one is super expensive. We can't get it. That's a conversation you just don't want to have, right? We can't just go get a new car because they're now in real terms so expensive. Can I pay my mortgage? Yes. Is the economy crippling? No. But the real cost of living is going to create a lot of discussions that are going to be very, very difficult to have, and it can be offset. There was actually a comment here that I want to hit on that the wealthiest get to go live stream and play golf, but the cost is the jobs. The cost doesn't have to be the jobs. If you go back to the original point that was made in this video, and he's right about, right, it's the government that requires you to earn dollars to then pay the tax, right? That's the requirement. And so why don't you have a job? Well, you don't have a job because the government isn't supplying enough dollars to satiate the demand for those who want the dollars, to work for the dollars, to get them. That is definitionally just what unemployment is. Unemployment is, I want dollars in the US as we define it. I want dollars and no one is willing to give them to me for my labor. That is definitionally what unemployment is. Well, who is the issuer of the dollar? Who creates the dollar? There are 2 money creating engines. The private sector can create a loan. The loan deposit payer creates a dollar, or the government can not tax as much as it is, or just put more dollars out there. And that is how you get lower unemployment, right? You just actually, you can spend. So the job itself is a policy decision that is divorced from the reality that, yeah, there are some who are living a better life than they would have had the exchange rate thing not taken place. And you can get the best of both worlds is what I'm trying to say. We could have had the best of both worlds and we did for 20 years. I mean, there was tons of bad policy on top of that. I'm not saying the distribution of it was good, but we really got the best of both worlds. We were able to print whatever we wanted, and the rest of the world wanted to save in it because they wanted to export to the U.S.
Right. Okay.
Listen, if another country buys U.S. treasuries, that's essentially other countries lending money to the U.S. governments. Again, a big component of the dollar ecosystem. And the U.S. government...
That's them saving in dollars is the way we would describe it, right?
Yeah, so no one's ever lending the money to the U.S. And this is it's kind of crazy these
you don't, this argument. When you have a bank account, you don't think, oh, I'm lending my money to the bank, right? People don't conceptualize it that way, right? They think I'm saving my dollars in a bank account. They're holding my money for me and giving me some kind of interest rate.
Yeah, and that is, and again, he has what's called in the economic world like a loanable funds view, and the idea is there's this a pool of money that's out there, it's essentially fixed, and that the U.S. when it wants to spend has to grab some of that money out. And the way that it does that is issue treasuries to get that money out of this pool of money that just kind of exists, and then they can spend it for the things that they want. Right?
Yeah.
That's not how you can't. You can't. I mean, if you just think about it, if there was no money at all, where would the dollars come from to begin with? Well, they would come from the government just issuing them, and that's true always. When the government spends in net more than it taxes in, it's creating that money. So the $39 trillion that he's going to quote here, whatever he quotes, is how many dollars the U.S. has created and were ultimately saved back in treasuries. That is all that it is. So they've spent. I mean, they've probably spent quadrillions of dollars, taxed quadrillions of dollars, but the 39 trillion that he's going to quote here in just a second are just what the private sector has decided to save in treasuries.
Right. I always conceptualize it that way. It's so easy, but people they don't want to do it. They can't possibly do it. They want to think of it as the mortgage debt that they owe the bank.
Yes.
It needs money. Like this year, the government's going to collect about $5 trillion in taxes. So you can think of that as the government's income. And the government's going to spend about $7 trillion. So bring in 5 and spend 7. Okay, so how do you do that? Like, how do you spend $7 trillion when you earn $5 trillion? The answer is that you borrow the difference. The government's going to sell treasuries, which are basically IOUs. I just want you to take a look.
See, this is what I was saying about the business perspective. This is how you think about it if you're running a business, but it's not how you think about it if you're running a monetary system. You don't think of it in terms of, I need to borrow money.
Look at how much the national debt has been growing over the past few years. Thanks to negligent overspending by the U.S. government. Like, to me, it's actually quite disturbing. Like, this is up to fiscal year 2025. And now the U.S. government is in debt $39 trillion. And I want to ask you this simple math question. How long is it going to take to pay back $39 trillion when you overspend by $2 trillion a year? And the answer is never. The situation has gotten so bad that there's not enough buyers of U.S. treasuries. There's not enough demand. That's why the Federal Reserve has been printing money to make up the difference. So when you have this fiscal irresponsibility combined with money printing, it makes other countries trust less in the US dollar system. So sure, if they buy US treasuries, they're going to get paid back with some interest. However, they're getting paid back with devalued dollars.
Okay, let me interject for the first time.
Yes, I was wondering where you were.
Did he say that the reason they're printing money is because people aren't buying treasuries?
That is the argument he made, correct.
Isn't that the opposite? Does that make any sense?
It does not make any sense, no.
The way that we make money is by printing treasuries in the first place.
Okay. So sort of? this is where things get kind of confusing, because we have a law on the books that absolutely says the Treasury itself cannot just directly print reserves and add them to buy things, right?
Right.
So what the Treasury, if it wants to spend, it actually has to get the reserves first and then spend them, right? So you're a military manufacturer of tanks, you sell a tank, right? And Congress says, yep, we are absolutely going to buy your tank. And they pass a law that says the Sitch tank buying law. And you're selling your tank for $1 billion. But you look in the TGA, the
Nice.
Treasury General account, right? So you look in the TGA and there's not $1 billion there, right? There's only $900 million of reserves there. Now the government does not have enough money to pay for that. So what they do is they auction off treasuries to the private sector. So the private sector will ultimately buy those treasuries. Let's just say there's the 100 million that they're going to buy. And now all of a sudden the TGA has enough money in it to now buy the tank. Now, what I just explained is exactly what he's trying to say. Yeah, Doug, did you just say the government actually creates the money when it spends, but now you're telling me it actually has to borrow it? Well, no. And what's happening is again, if you go back to this idea of there were no dollars to begin with, and you have this, and it's a self-imposed constraint, right? There's no law of nature that says the Treasury just couldn't issue reserves directly to buy your tank, right? I mean, they absolutely could. You would get a deposit, the banking system would get a reserve. Fine, that could absolutely happen. Nothing is stopping that from happening. But Congress over time has said they don't want the Treasury to have that power, so they've created this system where they can only spend out of the TGA, and the only way the TGA fills this general account, so this is your checking account, is through taxes or through the issuance of new bonds. Now let's just bring it back to, let's just say there's no money in the system whatsoever. Where the hell do you get these reserves from, right? How do you facilitate the buying of your $1 billion tank without any reserves or any money in the system at all to begin with? What you do is you create a central bank to facilitate this lending transaction. And it's very similar to kind of how you would close on a house. You're going to sit down, the Treasury is going to sit down, the central bank is going to sit down, and the primary dealer who's going to buy the bond are all going to sit down, and they're going to say, hey, here's what we're going to do.
Which is usually a bank, like Bank of America
bank,
or
yep.
something. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. They're all going to sit down and they're going to say, I need these reserves, the Treasury, right? I need these reserves in my TGA. The Fed can create reserves out of nothing. And private sector, you want to hold these bonds. And when you do, you will then have the money in the system to transact to actually buy the tank that we want, right? So there's something that we want to buy, okay? And so what you're going to do is you're going to have the central bank lend. This is what the repo market is. They're going to lend the reserves necessary to the bank to purchase the bonds that will now go to the bank to then fill the reserves of the checking account, the TGA, for the Treasury to then buy the tank. And now all of a sudden the tank has effectively been bought with the treasuries that were issued. And the bank then has to come up with the reserves, which are now in the system because the transaction occurred where the tank was bought, to then settle this, what's called a repo agreement, a repurchase agreement, that they will now purchase back the Treasury. And now you've found the loophole with the three parties to get the reserves into the system to settle it. And now,
so who gets the bond here? Does the Fed end up with the bond?
In this instance, yes, but
Okay.
what actually ends up happening, because there's a whole infrastructure built up and there are tons of reserves out there.
The Fed gets the bond. The tank manufacturer gets the cash, but the cash
deposits,
ends up in the reserves of the bank.
The bank has that as a reserve. Now
Right.
the bank is like, hey, I've got these reserves on my book. That Treasury looks a lot better than the reserves that I have. I'm now going to go buy that Treasury.
Okay. So that's the last step of the thing. Okay,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
So the bank ends up buying the Treasury with Sitch's tank money.
Exactly. So now all of a sudden you have, at this point, run this a billion times over, right? And now all of a sudden you have a mature financial sector, right? And this does some really fascinating things, right? Think about this. A bank wants what they call pristine collateral, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
The Treasury. It's the bond.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So now the bank is actually now more incentivized than they were before to make the next loan. Yeah. So now you've got, some guy who wants to start a shrimp restaurant or something like that in Alaska. And you're like, it doesn't make much sense. But with that being said, I'm gonna let it happen because I know I have some pristine collateral where if this loan goes bad, I actually have an income generating asset on my balance sheet, and I'm going to be more likely to give a loan, to extend a loan to a riskier endeavor. Why? Because I'm getting some free interest. So as the government spends, it's actually collateralizing with better collateral than would have been there otherwise when it spends. It makes a more robust financial sector that encourages more lending through multiple streams, right? The profit stream, now we're looking at the financial sector. There's actually a benefit to the government spending and getting those bonds out there. And this is why when you raise interest rates, you actually see a spike in lending. Why? Because the interest, amongst other reasons, but one of them is the spike in interest that the banks are getting from those now higher yielding treasuries helps support the yield they need out of their entire book that would be on a bank. So just to throw that out there too, for those of you who are kind of deep in the weeds on this as well, there's actually a benefit to raising rates for the banks. And that is because they now have their entire portfolio now has a higher yield on it. So, but going back to
that ends up being corporate profits for the bank,
correct,
and higher stock prices, all kinds of things.
No, hold on, I'm seeing this right here. Derek, I don't know, might is Derek. No, the banks aren't creating the money. The central bank has to create the reserves. What is the question that he's asking? Well, he just said it is true when the government borrows from banks that the banks just create it to get the treasuries. No, the bank is not creating the loan to get the treasury. The bank actually can't create the reserve. Only the central bank can do that. It's really important. A lot of people kind of think that they get the idea that loans can create money through deposits, but there's no reserves that get created in that scenario. Only the government can add those reserves in.
Right. Should we move on?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so if other countries and central banks are moving away from dollars, then what are they doing with their savings and their trade surpluses? So instead of getting dollars to buy US treasuries, they've been heavily purchasing gold, like physical gold, and I've shown you the chart of how much it's grown by. Now, let's talk about the US dollar in global trade. But before we go any further, let's be realistic about this. Despite all these developments, the US dollar is still the dominant global currency, right? So the majority of global trade still involves the dollar. Most commodities are still priced in dollars. However, as I told you earlier, de-dollarization is a process. It's not an event. And the de-dollarization process is in progress. Here's what we're seeing. We're seeing more bilateral trade agreements being settled in local currencies outside of the dollar. We're seeing countries experimenting with alternative payment systems as well. Now, none of these are going to replace the dollar overnight, but it does gradually reduce its share. And over time, this is going to have real consequences. And I just want to say this, the sad part is that the US government is accelerating the process of de-dollarization. Okay, what am I referring to? I'm talking about the sanctions and the geopolitics, abusive implementation and bad policies, which is making the situation even worse. For example, I want you to take a look at what happened in Russia. The war between Ukraine and Russia, it's really a proxy war. It's really the United States against Russia. Well, I guess you could say the US and allies against Russia. So the US's strategy was to sanction Russia, to isolate their economy and financially devastate their country, right? Like that was the goal. And while sanctions did have an impact, Russia adapted. It increased their trade with other countries, it shifted transactions into other currencies, and it built alternative financial pathways. Now, again, this doesn't mean that sanctions failed entirely, but it does show that countries can adjust. And that adjustment often involves reducing reliance on the US dollar. So our master plan, it actually backfired and it accelerated de-dollarization. And I'm sure you're not oblivious to this. Just take a look at what's happening in Iran. The war in Iran is a war of choice. You know, they never attacked us. They don't have nukes. The U.S. government wanted regime change, right? And it's also a proxy war against China because most of that oil from Iran, about 90% of that goes to China. And these oil transactions, they're getting done in yuan, which is very upsetting to the U.S. governments. And why is this upsetting to the U.S. governments?
A war of choice, Adam. A war of choice?
I know.
Really? Really? We're just going to believe that Iran didn't have any weapons of mass destruction? What is this nonsense?
Yeah, I
We're
know.
listening
He's got a very mainstream kind of right-wing perspective on all this stuff. So
Is this the right-wing perspective? This is like the populist isolation perspective, right?
Then that's mostly on the right. I don't want to argue about left and right. It is a popular perspective that's out there. I don't necessarily agree. Look, I don't necessarily agree that Ukraine is a proxy war. Like we were telling Russia to invade Ukraine. What?
Right.
How's it a proxy war?
I guess proxy in terms of like why we care about it, but there's no implication. Like, well,
did Russia invade Ukraine because they want to go to war with the U.S.?
Right. Some people want to argue that we, goaded Russia into doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's a common argument that uninformed people make.
Is that on the right or the left? It's
both,
left and right is so weird these days because it's not really. It's very much breaking down. So.
Okay, so here's how the dollar system works.
This is why I like Douglas, because Douglas MMT does have a real commie problem where there's a lot of people who are MMT enthusiasts that are like socialists and Doug and I are both red-blooded capitalists. We understand the incentive structure.
Amen, brother.
Yeah.
Amen. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. No one has done more damage to the MMT progress than the bleeding heart liberals, and bless their heart. I want many of the similar outcomes as they do, but you don't got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And certainly the way I can go on forever. I mean, look. Are there distributional issues that have just been absolutely, it just doesn't sell. It just doesn't, obviously, America should have the tallest building in the world still, right? Like,
hell yeah.
America, we should have a plane that gets you, Mach 2 from New York to LA, right? Like, I mean, whatever.
Why are we updating Mount Rushmore?
Yeah.
Wow.
My point is, and I, there's some on the left that do the prosperity thing, or whatever they were talking about.
Abundance over here.
Abundance. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Prosperity is the gospel message of prosperity. Yeah. The abundance, and it's, I mean, to me, that is attainable, fiscally, right? Like you really can just do something at a national level. And I mean, some of the stuff I love that I've been hearing, I mean, I would think it would be awesome to do a moon base and all that sort of stuff. But when you're, gutting NASA's budget and telling them to get to the moon at the same time, like it just,
mixed messages.
You can't have both. And so, yeah, I'll digress on politics, but, it is painful to see how the left has just completely ruined what I think is a legitimate macroeconomic understanding of what we could have and could achieve.
Just one more gripe before we move on. They did a MMT movie with Stephanie Kelton, and the whole movie is about climate change. And I'm like, what the heck is going on?
The finding the money.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean. The good news is that is something that we could, insofar as you can solve it with, through the purse, it is. But to me, it is a very small segment of the broader mission of just building a better economy. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, the MMT crowd, if they ever want to fully get taken seriously at the across the spectrum, needs to drop the kind of constant victimhood.
Heavy partisan messaging. Yeah. That's all I'm saying about the climate change stuff. It's like, I thought we were learning economics here. I mean, there's a time and a place for the climate change stuff, but it's not in a movie about economics.
Yes.
It's not in a movie about
beyond,
finance.
hey, it's something we could solve, but move along, and there are many other things that we could solve. Yeah.
All right, let's go.
If Iran sold their oil in US dollars, then with those dollars that they earned, they would take those dollars and they would invest it into US treasuries. But what's happening in Iran? Iran is selling their oil to China. Iran is getting paid in yuan. And with those yuan, Iran is buying Chinese goods. Okay, so what are they buying from China? They're buying machinery, manufacturing equipment, weapons, electronics, vehicles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, steel, solar panels, etc. And of course, the US government doesn't like this. The US government wants that money for the US. So the goal was regime change, have Iran price their oil in dollars, and with those dollars, Iran would buy American products, invest in the US stock market, and most importantly, buy US treasuries. However, Iran refuses to cooperate and submit to the US. I just want you to
see. Yeah, we really want Iran to buy our treasuries.
That was the goal of the war.
That's what we're really desperate for.
Okay.
It is funny though, because I can imagine policymakers in the Trump administration thinking that this is a legitimate argument, like that we. I mean, Obama did the exact same thing in the post-Great Financial Crisis when they passed. I forget what the name of the big spending thing was. It was like $900 billion or something, which is a lot back then. He actually said back then. Now it's just a drop in the bucket.
So
baby.
True. Yeah.
It's crazy in my lifetime, my adult lifetime, but it's happened that fast. But he sent an entire envoy to China to be like, "Hey, you guys are still going to buy our treasuries, right? If we pass this spending thing." And I mean, this exact same idea here that we need to stop transactions between Iran and China from going outside the U.S. dollar system, because that means somehow we can't end up funding the government. Which at the end of the day, if the government really wants zero, Trump's idea is to get rates as low as possible. And admittedly, the interest income being paid on the treasuries, the interest being paid on the treasuries has been highly inflationary. It's 1.2, 1.3 trillion annualized right now that's going out there. I agree. You'll have more fiscal space elsewhere if you can get the yields down on that. But that has nothing to do with China having to settle oil contracts with Iran in the dollar or not, and them ultimately saving, right? I mean, the Congress could come out tomorrow and just say, Fed, we're done with you guys setting interest rates. We're setting a permanent 0 interest rate or a permanent 0.25% interest rate. That's going to be it forever. And you guys just no longer have that lever. And the U.S. government would be able to issue every single note, bill, and bond at 0.25% into infinity, and we would never go back to it again.
God, the stock market would boom because no one would be getting interest income anywhere.
Well, on the short run, it would boom because of discounted cash flows dropping to zero. On the back end, you would have interest income coming much lower, and then you'd get a drop. But eventually, it would stabilize, and we'd get into like we did it, right? We effectively did it for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017. We were at near 0% interest rates for an entire decade. And what did you get? Very low inflation, very low growth, not terrible growth, but a relatively low growth rate. And it was just, no real crises emerged or anything like that. So, I mean, it was the most benign financial decade in history.
And you think the fuel for our growth now is high interest rates because of the interest income?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a remaining part of it. Absolutely. So the current deficit right now is about 1.8 trillion, and interest income is 1.3 trillion. Yeah, I mean, we would be darn near in surplus, definitely in real terms in a surplus right now. By that, I just mean removing wealth from the private sector to the public sector. And that absolutely, every time we get that, we have a recession, 2022, or a major bear market, 2022, 2008, 2000, during the 70s. I mean, every single time that happens, you're just confiscating wealth, and that destroys growth. So yeah, the majority,
or as he would say, paying it back. You're paying back the deficit.
Paying back the debt. Yeah.
Yes, by confiscating people's bank accounts.
That historically, Oil has been priced and traded in US dollars. So that's a major reason why global demand for dollars has remained strong. But now we're starting to see changes. Multiple countries are exploring energy trade in Chinese yuan, in local currencies, and alternative settlement systems. But even small shifts in energy markets matter because energy is one of the largest global markets. And if more transactions move outside the dollar, then that's going to reduce demand for dollars. Additionally, I want you to take a look at what Iran is doing. The toll that they're charging is in Chinese yuan, not US dollars. That's why the US is pretty upset right now. Now, a very good question is, how do we judge the progress of de-dollarization? And I would say that the best indicator is the US Treasury markets. When countries trade in dollars, they accumulate all these dollars and then they use those dollars to buy US Treasuries. So if all these countries are transacting in dollars, there's going to be big demand for US Treasuries, and that's going to give us lower interest rates.
They don't necessarily have to buy treasuries, though. They could buy Apple stock. They could buy real estate.
They can do whatever they want.
Yeah, real estate in Southern California. Yeah.
Your deposit, you can do what you want with it. Yep.
Which it has been. And of course, lower interest rates are good for the US government because they borrow money, and that's good for Americans that need to take out whatever type of loan, whether it be a mortgage or an auto loan or student loans or credit cards, etc. Okay, I just want to say this. If you're still not following along, like how all this works, I want to explain it to you like this. Let's just say that Michael Jordan announces, like he says, I need some people to lend me some money. Okay, in that case, I guarantee you there's going to be big demand to lend him money because some people just love Jordan, or they would do it in hopes to meet Jordan or for whatever reason. So you're going to have people saying, Jordan, I'll lend you money at a good rate. I'll lend you money, you just got to pay me a 4% interest rate. And someone else is going to be like, no, Jordan, I'll lend you money for 3%. And someone else is going to be like, no, Jordan, let me lend you money. Just give me 2%. You see, when there's strong demand, the interest rate is going to go down. It's going to be the same thing for treasuries. If there's strong demand for US treasuries, then the interest rate's going to go down because people are willing to lend money at a lower rate. Now, let's just say that David Freeman says the same thing. I need some people to lend me some money. I'm telling you, you're not going to get the same reaction as Jordan. Like, do you know who David Freeman is? No? Well, I mean, I don't know him either. Like, I never heard of a David Freeman in my life. So if David Freeman asks people to lend him money, people are going to be like, no, like, I'm not going to lend you money. You know, some people are going to be like, David, I'll lend you money if you pay me an interest rate of 15%, because I don't know who the hell you are. So you see, when there's less demand, then the interest rate's going to go up. Interest rates need to go up in order to incentivize people to lend money to you. Now, I'm telling you, it's going to be the same thing with US Treasuries. If there's fewer people transacting in dollars, then there's going to be less demand for US Treasuries, which means that interest rates will go up. And that's going to be terrible news for the US government, who's in debts by $39 trillion. And that's going to be bad for Americans that are looking to get a mortgage or auto loan or student loans or whatever it may be. So ultimately, what is going on with the world? They're transacting less in dollars. China, Russia, Iran, BRICS, they're saving less in dollars, so there's less demand for dollars. And when there's less demand for dollars, the currency becomes even more devalued. So we're talking about less purchasing power for Americans and for our governments, which means a lower standard of living. And that's the consequence of de-dollarization. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you have aspirations to become poorer in the future?
Can I stop it there?
Yeah, go ahead.
He's going to give his pitch for gold. And I do have aspirations for getting poor in the future. So I'm going to find out how to do it.
I want to be filthy rich. I think greed works.
Yeah. Mr. D, man, you literally ask a question. I'm like, I don't know if we'll get to it, but he just set it up. I mean, this is a really good point that he just made that needs to be discussed. So essentially what he's trying to say is like, look, the US, they have to borrow, right? So we've already determined why that's not actually the case, but let's go with his argument. They have to borrow, and their credibility is now being undermined because they've weaponized the dollar, they've printed too much, the Fed, the debt's too big, the Fed, all that sort of stuff. And so what he's making is this bond vigilante argument. This is the bond vigilante argument that no one's going to lend us the dollars, and that's why interest rates are going to go up, right? And that is all true if we were under some sort of fixed exchange, backed currency. All that is true, right? But we're not, and we're in a fiat currency system. So none of that is true. And how this works, like what ends up happening is the Fed, that auction that occurred that he talked about earlier, where no one bought it, right? The Fed goes out and they say we're going to issue these bonds or these treasuries at a certain yield, right? But private sector buy them. Right. Mm-hmm. And what they're essentially that's going to stay somewhere around what the Fed funds rate is going to be, because they're deemed by the private sector just as almost as safe as the effectively cash. Right. And the point that he's making is no one's going to want to buy these things because the spread between what the Fed target rate is trying to get at and what the bonds ultimately get issued at that are being bought is going to rise because no one wants to buy them.
Yeah, people are going to say give us a better deal. We want a higher interest rate.
We demand more yield. Yeah, we demand more yield. Yeah, exactly.
And we're not going to give you any money unless it happens. Despite the fact that we've got this three-way tank deal lined up in the background.
Exactly. So the U.S. understands this. They understand their hands have been tied with the provisions that have put in that they can't directly spend reserves. And that's why they've set up the primary dealer system. The primary dealers have to bid on these things. And if they don't, then the next auction just happens.
Yeah.
They lose their membership. And the reason they don't bid never has to do with the fact that they don't want the bonds. The demand is always there because the reserves are always being added in. The banks usually don't want reserves. The banks really during the post-Great Financial Crisis period did not want reserves. The banking system was over-reserved by trillions for a decade, right?
Why don't they want reserves?
Because they don't yield anything. I mean, back in the day they don't. And,
right, they do pay interest on reserves now.
But they only pay in reserves. That just gives them more reserves. They want
cash.
Yeah. They want actual deposits themselves that they can then use outside of the banking sector itself, right? So, but what
reserves are kind of like a tally sheet between banks and the Federal Reserve, right?
Yep. If you and I bank at different banks and we have a transaction that takes place, and we need to essentially show that transaction switch of deposits between you and I, the banks are going to settle that on the back end in the reserve system, right? We're like, I think one of the only countries that calls them reserves. I think Canada calls them settlement deposits or something like that.
Okay.
Which makes a lot more sense, right? Like you're distinguish these things separate from a lot of people think cash or deposit.
Reserves are cash, like they're just
correct, and that's correct, and that's why people think they're printing money. No, they're not. They're taking assets that already existed and converting them into reserves, and then the Fed holds them. They create the reserves. No money printing was happening. They were just facilitating the settlement that needed to the settlement. Right. That's what Canada calls settlement balances. They're facilitating the settlement that needed to take place. Going back to the interest rates going up, they're not going to go up. Really what you're doing when you're determining, do I want to buy a bond or not, is you're really just saying, do I think the Federal Reserve is going to lower or raise interest rates relative to what they're at right now? That's really the bet you're making. And if you think they are going to lower interest rates, that means the return itself, like the actual price of the bond, is going to go up. And so if you have a certain idea that the Fed's going to lower interest rates, then you'd want to bet long bonds. And then there's more complicated math that goes into it to determine how that goes out throughout the yield curve. And are you indifferent to rolling over a 1 month treasury indefinitely, or do you want to tie that cash up and get a slightly better what's called term premium to hold on to these bonds in 30 years, right? So you're gonna get paid a little bit more. But if a law got created tomorrow that said Federal Reserve no longer actually gets to set the interest rate, and we're just keeping it at 0.25% in forever,
there would be no bets.
The entire yield curve is going to collapse, right? And the only reason interest rates would go up is because you get a sniff that maybe they're going to overturn that law, right?
Yeah.
And then some new party's going to have control over that. But we saw. I mean, I know that this is true because this happened to Japan for 30 years. Japan had a 0% interest rate policy across the board, and their entire yield curve for the vast majority of that time period always stayed near zero, right? And I even think they eventually started issuing more than 30-year bonds, and these things stayed at zero or near zero the entire time. When did it finally start to fall apart? When their central bank said, we're going to start raising interest rates, right? Well, yeah, I mean, now all of a sudden you're willing to do that. Now that opens the door to higher interest rate policy, and now they are having what they would call an issue of interest rates going higher because, in fact, I mean, they have, in dollar terms, they have, I think it's like doubled or tripled the amount of public debt that we do. So you can imagine just an interest rate of 2% hike in Japan creates just a flood of new money. And so now they're actually facing inflationary problems. Why? Because they started to raise interest rates with such a massive public debt.
Wow. So would you buy gold now? I would not, because it seems way overpriced. It's over $1,000 an ounce now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 4,500. Is that where we're at with gold?
So it's even more than way more than $1,000.
We had so gold hit. I don't follow gold on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
I will tell you this. I'm not. Gold took absolutely took a big hit at the beginning of the year. So it ran up super big at the beginning of the year, and then in January it took a huge hit. We're at $4,600 an ounce right now. I'm not against gold here. In fact, really once Liberation Day took place, I got very bullish gold. I got very bullish anything. I got very bullish of investing and diversifying outside of the U.S. That's really been my play since Liberation Day. Get yourself diversified outside the U.S. I don't know who's going to win. I don't, the point he brought up is a really good point. Who else is there but the U.S.? And he made this point that it's going to be a process. I mean, even everything we've done to ourselves, from what I would see is pushing against the system that's been created the last 50 some odd years. Even despite that, there's no one like that I really want to save in their currency, right? Like Europe is probably the next best bet, but Europe can't help themselves but kill innovation over there. I mean, it's a cesspool of bureaucracy, and I mean, beyond the chips they make in, was it Denmark with, is it Denmark? I'm forgetting the chip company that is up there that makes the fabs for the, that they then send over to the Taiwan semiconductor. Someone help me out in chat. Why am I forgetting this? But beyond that, I mean, there is nothing of innovation over there.
Right.
And, but they do have a very strong legal system, and I mean that's something. I don't know, China. I don't know if I really trust saving in yuan.
I wouldn't. Yeah, ooh, I can't imagine.
There's not a better. I mean, at this point, the people that really push back that I listen to, they're like, well, Doug, where is anyone else going to go? And that's a very good question: is where are they going to go? So what I've done and what I where I've positioned, and I've never done this in all my investing years, but I'm really diversifying outside the U.S. Emerging markets have been a good play. Europe has been a good play. You can find these what are called ex-US ETFs that are just the large cap companies outside the U.S. In part because one, you just get a diversified aspect, but two, now more than ever, portfolios are facing dollar risk in a way that they never have. What I mean by that is when you buy the S&P 500 and you buy your SPY and your 401k, you're inherently going long the dollar when you're doing that, and you're going short every other currency. And I'm 41. I imagine you guys are on the same bracket. For the 20 some odd years that we've had a professional career, we've never had to think about the dollar collapsing dramatically in any way. And if it does, who benefits from that? Well, it's every other asset outside of the U.S. is going to benefit from that, and gold has been one of those that makes sense as part of a kind of diversified attack at this. If crap gets really bad and you don't know where to save it all, yeah, I mean, I think gold makes a lot of sense and could get another leg up here. But if you really start getting the settling down of kind of the geopolitical tensions, then all of a sudden I think it's still going to be dollar that Dow's not going to do well, but you're going to get a lot of benefit outside the U.S. Oil has been a great diversifier even before the Iran thing took place, and it's nothing to do with my call on oil. When you get late cycle, when you get countries like or blocks like Europe, emerging markets that really want to invest and grow, well, that takes oil and that puts upward pressure. And I'll tell you, oil producers, when they smell that money's flowing, they're fine wrecking the entire economy, especially the Saudis, by jacking oil through the roof. They did it in 2014, 2015. They did it obviously famously in 2008. They did it in 2000. They'll do it again if the money is there to purchase it and they can run the wells for long enough. They will, and they're a monopoly price setter. So they will push the price higher if they smell that they can get away with it. I think they can. So that's been a good diversifier as well. And even though some of these plays have had really strong moves, I'm not I'm not thinking that this type of move is over at this point. And I kind of agree with his finally where he lands, but for a completely different reason. Nothing to do with the petrodollar system.
Right.
Nothing at all to do with the petrodollar system. It has to do with the fact that the U.S., the electorate in the U.S. has said, we want to not import anymore, right? I think Trump was very clear that what he wants to do is get in front of importing. Now, how he's doing it is terrible, but it's very clear that the U.S. wants these domestic manufacturing jobs to be recreated. Obviously, the policy decisions to do that have been terrible. But regardless, it seems to be what the U.S. voters want. And so one way or another, we're not going to create policies that incentivize importing, which I just call that process decoupling.
Yeah, I think a lot of people call it decoupling. So that's interesting. I think last time you were on, you were playing the S&P 500 pretty steadily, and now you're diversifying outside the U.S.
Yeah. And again, it is in part because of the policy decisions that have been made to this point. I don't remember. I'm going to look up. I got to figure out when I came on last, but
seems like I know I was going to look it up before the stream. Let's finish this video off.
Okay. Like, if you don't want to become poor for you and your family, then you should ask the question, how do I protect myself from de-dollarization? And I'll tell you, there's many ways to do it, but in my opinion, I believe that the best way to do it is to buy gold to protect yourself. Like, you can buy physical gold, which I've done. You can buy gold on the stock markets, which I've done. Or you can buy gold stocks. There's gold miners, there's gold royalty companies, there's gold streaming companies, which I've done too. Okay, why gold? It's because that's where the demand is going. Look at the central banks. Like, the people with the money printers. And the best part is, of course, they can't print gold. I'm going to end with this. If you want to see what I'm specifically investing in, come join me.
Okay. Join the Discord, guys. Obviously, I've heard, like, people don't want to buy, people don't want to sell Russia stuff in any sort of currency, so they're forcing Russia to use gold to buy things like oil and military hardware and stuff like that. So that's obviously got to put pressure on the price of gold as well, not just because they think gold is valuable.
Yeah. One thing with gold too, on that point, when central banks do decide to purchase or to
our community on our Patreon sites,
to rearrange the reserves that are on their balance sheets, I mean, they move in massive amounts of money, and the gold markets are not terribly large.
They're small.
Purchasing. They're in terms of what's actually being traded day in and day out. So when you do get central banks make, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small moves to purchase more gold to have on their balance sheets, that is going to move gold up. And absolutely what he's saying, there are some still big players that made some very big moves to get more gold onto the balance sheets of the central bank. Absolutely. That definitely occurred. And I have no problem. I mean, probably the big move in gold has already taken place. I don't, and there are definitely pathways specifically with gold that things could go wrong. But as part of the entire spectrum, heck, even before Trump came into office, we were still in a spot where commodities in general, I saw someone say uranium, were bound to do well because, again, in late cycle, in late cycle, and by that I just simply mean as the credit cycle has matured over time, that is when the kind of inflationary element of the business cycle takes place, and kind of, you know, commodities, materials, those sort of things are going to get a benefit when you get into late cycle because everyone needs them. They become bottlenecked, and what ends up happening is when you get a large, we're going to get into some macro theory. When you get a large expansion of growth. So a bunch of businesses say, I'm going to build a factory, I'm going to do this sort of investment, I'm going to build an AI farm, a bunch of NVIDIA cards and that sort of stuff. Immediately the money has to get created to do that, right? So that the balance sheets expand immediately. And then what ends up happening is, you know, you've got to now sell all your goods and services at a profit, right? And there are raw materials that are going to come in that price this. So the prices rise after the balance sheet expansion occurs, right? And so we're a year later from a massive investment boom that took, actually a couple years later now from the massive investment boom that's really taken place from 2020, the end of, say, 2023 until today. And now the prices finally rise to support all of this debt that got created, these loans that got created, because because it just simply has to. If you don't raise your price to settle all at the macro level, to settle all the debt, to create the revenue, to settle the loans that were out there, you know, you're going to default and you're going to have a collapse. And eventually we will get there. But the first, you know, stage in that is to see this big push in prices rising. And so that's why I think, you know, materials and uranium was it was good. All that sort of stuff I liked even before you added on just the double whammy now of Liberation Day, dollar dropping. You're just seeing an enhanced move across the board that was inevitable. I thought oil pushing higher was inevitable. Did I think it was because of Iran? No. But when you get late cycle, the Saudis themselves are absolutely primed to raise the price to get the profit that they can. Yeah.
Let me see if I can lay out this credit cycle, because I've heard you talk about this credit cycle before, and it's very fascinating. So you're saying there's some sort of investment boom that takes place. Everybody thinks we're going to build a bunch of AI data centers, right? So they create a bunch of loans, and those loans all have some sort of interest rate attached to them. And in order for there to be enough money to pay back the loan with the interest, they need to essentially grow the money supply in concert with that. So they're trying to create price stability, but obviously you have a small inflation rate that takes place during this process. Is that basically how it works?
Yeah. So think, yeah, we'll just put this in. I mean, you're really close. You want to create a widget factory, right? Mm-hmm. And you get $100 loan to buy that factory to create these widgets, right? And then mm-hmm. at the macro level, the next person wants. You have to realize there's the next person that wants to create a widget factory, and because you are the less risky person than the next person, your loan is actually going to be cheaper. And, you know, you might get the $100 loan. The next guy has to do it at $105, right? But you get this cascading event where, because you made the loan, and when you make a loan, a deposit gets created with that loan, right?
Yeah.
So when you go get a loan, there's a deposit loan, there's new money out there that is actually now going to facilitate the purchasing of the widgets that you're going to make, right? You're going to pay your workers.
All the inputs.
They're going to buy the output of what it is. Then the next guy makes the widget maker, right? But his loan ends up getting extended slightly higher than yours. A couple reasons for this. There's just more money out there. And then two, he's technically more risky. But you just end up getting more and more loans that get created. So you get this massive expansion. But every time you create a loan deposit pair, the private sector becomes more profitable in and of itself, right? You're creating economic growth, and then everyone sees this, profits are rising. They want to invest and get in on this. And so that's when you get this investment boom, right? Now, this all starts because the government added the first layer of profits, which they did in 2022 when they raised interest rates and started paying $1 trillion a year on interest income. But then you actually get the business cycle to play out. Now, the reason prices rise at the end of it all and not at the beginning of it all is because now you have a valuation of all these loans, and you have an expectation of what you have to actually get when you start producing all of this to keep the value, to defend the value of the assets on the books. You have to raise the prices of the output to defend the value of the assets that you have. And I'm saying this at the macro level. At the micro level, obviously every guy is going to try and undercut the next guy. I get that. And those are deflationary pressures that offset the inflationary price rise. And if you can become more productive and your machine can, create 15 widgets when it used to do 10 widgets because of AI, you're going to get an offset of the inflationary pressure. But suffice to say, prices have to rise to defend the expanding balance sheets. And this was all set in place in 23, 24, and 25, that we had this massive credit boom that took place for the AI data centers and across a handful of different sectors. Now we're seeing the inflationary impulse take place, going all the way back, really, starting in 2025 and on to, forward, we were starting to get that inflationary impulse. So regardless, when that happens late cycle, that's when you want exposure to inflationary winners. We'll just call it that, right? Things that are going to benefit from higher prices.
So you're saying late cycle, but how does the cycle end?
Good question. Yeah, so the cycle's finally going to end when the government starts getting more tax revenue than they're adding, and that is when they actually start destroying the wealth of the private sector, right? Mm-hmm. So there are two I'll call automatic destabilizers that take place over time. When you create a loan and that creates business activity, you now have to pay taxes on that. That money was not added from the outside in from the government. That money was created from the inside. And now because you've created business activity, you now have to pay taxes on that, which actually takes wealth out of the private sector and into the public sector, right?
Okay. So all the loan generation and economic activity, that's all within the system. But as soon as the government comes in and says, well, I need to tax that activity, they're taking it out of the system. It's going into the Treasury general account.
Correct. Yep. And that's destroying the private sector wealth. So taxes, bad. Once you get into a surplus scenario, now all of a sudden you're just straight up, you're no longer adding to the pool of wealth that is out there. You are just straight up taking, right?
Right.
And again, this happened in 2022 momentarily. This happened in 2008. This happened in 2000. Every recession, this happens before that recession. The other way this happens is in real terms, we all have to save. We want to save for retirement. We got to save to pay taxes. We talked about that in the stream. We want to save to just grow our wealth, to buy assets. And you might, at the end of your life or before retirement, say, hey, I think I need $1 million to retire on, and that's my goal. Well, as balance sheets expand, so too is inflation. We just talked about a very simple way that ends up taking place. Now, all of a sudden, your $1 million that you thought you could retire on can only buy half of what it is that you thought you needed. So in real terms, as inflation pushes higher, it decreases the overall real value of what it is that you're saving for. And so now you need to save even more. And when you save and you decide not to spend, that destroys business activity as well, right? So if you say, okay, I'm not, I was going to drive up twice up to my cottage this year, but oil's super expensive. I'm not going to drive to I'm only going to do it one time. That destroys business activity that would have happened otherwise. And so in real terms, and there's an inflation tax there that's going to play out. And if the government doesn't get in front of that in some way to offset these two things, really the way that they do is either lowering taxes or increasing spending, you will get yourself into a scenario where you get a recession, and it always happens. So that's how it ends.
But growing the deficit is just it's a never-ending process.
It has to be.
Yeah. Okay.
If you want growth, if you want persistent growth, low unemployment, low inflation, all those sort of things over time. Yeah.
No, I'm down. All right. This was fascinating. Sitch, you want to say anything? Do you have any comments or?
No, there's some super chats, but.
Okay. Let's read the super chats and then.
Brian, thank you so much for the $20. Says, I'm late, but does Doug think that the gold investment is only cyclical due to a large amount of bond maturation coming up? What does the argument about China looking to use gold as a settlement structure for trade?
Yeah, so a lot of that does get discussed in throughout the stream. The bonds maturing is really a non-issue. Again, I don't think that that has the efficacy of what the impact that the vast majority of the macro landscape thinks that it does. In terms of like any one of these, I clump these all into what I call like kind of like liquidity arguments. Any one of these liquidity type events where now the Treasury has to issue a bunch of new treasuries might cause short-term movements in just because a lot of money is moving hands. But in terms of the trajectory of anything, I don't think it has any impact on kind of the longer-term trajectory, specifically with gold. I think gold pushed up in I do think central banks like China and Russia definitely were buying gold. I agree with that. They wanted to diversify exposure. I think gold also pushed higher because of the tariff thing, and I think that is the long-term trend that can continue to prop up gold. And again, going to the gold as settlement for trade, you go back and watch the part that we discussed with regards to why for every settlement that takes place, there's someone that has to sell what they have to buy the currency necessary to sell, and then the person who ends up with that currency has the same decision to make if they want to save in it or sell it, and it ends up being a net wash in terms of the logic.
Righteous Indifference, thanks so much for $2. Says new slogan: USA Findom to the world. There you go. I like it. Our Hiltz, hey, what's up? For $2 says debt isn't real, only fools pay back. That's true. Those damn Lannister fools. Gypsy Harlow for $2 says there's a lot of blah blah and zero solutions. Okay, I don't know what you want for solutions, but okay. The Real Holtzner for 20 months says it also helps to think about this from an accounting perspective. For every debt, there must be a credit.
Very true.
Balance sheets are very important. If you want to get into macro and you want to get into kind of causal macro thinking, the first step is to always just pull. I mean, quite literally, I'm doing balance sheets to talk some of this stuff out in real time. It's a necessary step to always think through. Yeah,
I love that stuff. Yeah.
Electro, the gamer for 19 months, thanks so much for being disciplined equal freedom, says, finally in the MMT stream, I was getting kind of worried that you guys won't talk about it unless, Sitch, did you see the video I DM'd you about it? I didn't, no. But I'll check it out. I guess it doesn't, I don't know, Adam, why don't you talk about MMT anymore?
People are reflexively against MMT, and like the intro of this video, this guy is probably obviously against MMT, but he lays out a principal tenet of MMT and seems to believe in it. So I don't know why he'd be reflexively against the conceptualization of the money system this way.
Why are people? Why? It's because of the way the left has handled it. I mean, I know the guys I have to deal with. It's absolutely nuts. I mean, it's. I try and bite my tongue on a lot of this stuff, but there are so many out there in the MMT world. I mean, Warren Mosler created MMT back in the 70s. I mean, first started understanding what we understand as MMT, and there's very little new in MMT. I mean, the only thing that Mosler really understood about MMT that was truly unique is that when the government issues treasuries, that's a reserve drain. They're doing that for a specific purpose, and that was like the one economic thing. Everything else, nothing new in terms of. They just put the pieces together differently. But he has been ridiculed by other MMTers and is not allowed at some conferences within the MMT world, despite being the guy. Why? Because he's technically considered ultra wealthy, right? So this dude who ran a hedge fund for 50 years, who made, I mean, I don't think he's billionaire status, but I know he's not hurting for money.
Yeah, definitely.
Who ran a very successful hedge fund and understood this and played the treasury market better than anyone for nearly a decade. I think his treasury fund was called Triple I. But he doesn't get invited to conferences because they see him as like the man that we're fighting against. It's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. I used to get invited on to other MMT stuff, and there are obviously I want a better country just like anyone else, a better world just like anyone else, but I don't get invited anymore because I'm seen as the guy who likes to understand how to use this for
make money.
To make money. And I mean, one of the things too, actually, in this video that he finishes up with is like, ignore this at your own peril if you want to not get not protect yourself. And I agree, man. I mean, like, do something. If you hate how the world is and you think they're screwing everyone over, just do something about it. And I don't know, I don't bemoan anyone for trying to make their lives better insofar as, if you're not stealing from your neighbor, you're not doing that sort of thing, and you're trying to get out there and make your life better. And if part of this is just being more savvy in your investment, being more savvy in how it is you're saving money and what you're doing, we should not, the MMT movement should not make it a point to penalize to look to go after those people, because when I hear people saying, well, this is what MMT thinks, deficits don't matter, all that sort of stuff, that is obviously not what we're saying. And so clearly what I hear is MMT equals big government just trying to steal your wealth in some way. And that's clearly the message that's getting, it's getting out there. And people did associate the inflation with MMT, and despite like all the mainstream MMT are saying don't do the stimulus, it still got tacked on at that time. But it is what it is. I mean, those of us I mean, Adam, I know you followed me for quite a long time. I mean, we have been, crushing the markets hand over fist for quite a long time. And it does not, I'm not losing sleep over the fact that no one likes me. But
this is kind of why I stopped really talking about it, because I was like, well, I just should use this to like make money and just like fuck everyone who thinks it doesn't work.
Yeah, one of the charts I share quite often in my streams and we look at in my videos and everything is just deficit spending year over year in real terms. And every time it goes negative, you get a recession. I just, stocks follow flows. There's just no equity. I should be a little bit more clear on that. Asset valuations follow their underlying flows, and the primary underlying flow, the biggest mover out there, the 100-pound or the 1,000-pound gorilla, is fiscal spending, and then secondarily, it's credit, and you follow those at the most simple step, and you're going to do, you're at least going to be able to see in advance when the 2008s come, when the 2000s come, those sort of things. And at least be able to know what to look out for in terms of recessionary environment.
It's funny that is such an inconvenient truth for so many people, that the deficit spending is actually serves a function and is necessary to a growing economy. Even though Milton Friedman basically said the same thing, so I don't know why he gets away with it. All right, super chats.
Brian,
look, we've got some big ones rolling in now. Look at this.
I know. Says, what's wrong with MMT? What's wrong with MMT is the framing of government as the key driver for growth by increasing deficits. It can increase growth if government debt is used prudently, but banks do the same thing and they have an interest to do so.
Go ahead, Doug.
They don't do the same thing. Okay. I am within the MMT world. I'm one of the very few people that actually don't want a 0% interest rate policy, permanent 0% interest rate policy. The reason for this is I actually do want a very good private sector. I do want an abundance of lending. I do want massive risk taking, right? I love my new stuff, and the way to get that is for producers to take risks to push prices down. I want the expansion of the private sector as much as possible. With that being said, if we look at the private sector at the macro level, when a loan gets created, that does create money endogenously, but the loan and deposit
what does that mean, endogenously?
Endogenous means within the system. So exogenous means it was added from the outside in. Endogenous means just inside the system the money gets created.
And those two terms have to do with outside is government creation of
Correct.
Money, and inside is bank creation of money.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yep. So inside banks create money. So they do. So if there was no money in existence and you wanted to buy my house, we would go and you'd create a mortgage. And so again, there's no money. How are we going to facilitate this? A mortgage, a loan is going to get created. They're going to, the bank is going to momentarily give you the deposits that you're then going to give to me for the house. You're going to get my house. I'm going to have the deposits now. And what's on the balance sheet is for you you have a house and a mortgage. So you're no wealthier or poorer. I'm sorry, you are poor because you now have the debt, but you have the asset outstanding to pay off. I too had an asset swap, which was my house for your deposit. But now the bank, where the money creation happened, they have the deposit, which is their liability, and then the mortgage loan, which is your liability, is their asset. What's important here is that money got created, deposits were created, but an offsetting liability got created, and they're both stuck in the system. So no new net wealth was created, right? You just had a transfer of an asset that was facilitated by the creation of money. In and of itself, that creates business activity and all this. And a bank is now more capitalized.
Yeah, because now you're going to go spend the house money on restaurants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Real business activity happens there. And I want that to happen as much as possible, right? But if you want if you want a private sector to grow, to be innovative, you need profits on top of what the private sector can create for the business sector itself. Because the only way the business sector can create a profit, if the government is not adding in that extra profit, is if the what we'll call them the consumer goes into debt, right? So when we were running huge surpluses in the late 90s into the dot-com bubble, how was the business sector so profitable? It's because the consumer was going into massive amounts of debt, right? That is actually unsustainable because that debt remains in the balance sheets of the private sector. If you want sustained growth, the liability has to stay outside of the balance sheets of the private sector and of the financial sector. And you do that when the government spends. That's like that is the magic. I mean, it's not magic. It's quite visible in terms of how it happens, but the government is adding the financial asset, the treasury. We walk through how this happens, but they're keeping the liability end of it outside of the financial sector. And that is why you get growth when government spends. You get massive growth when government spends.
Their debt is our savings accounts.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
And our savings accounts can't exist without that debt existing. All right.
Net, correct. Yes. Some player, yeah. But yeah, net.
Somebody somewhere is going to say we can use Bitcoin. We could just use Bitcoin.
We could.
You can save in Bitcoin.
We could. Oh God, can I? Can I send you a message? And can you put this image on screen?
Sure, totally. Yeah.
We could. And I wouldn't even be. I would be against it. But the image that's in this tweet right here is what inflation and deflation look like while we were under a gold standard from the founding of this country to the. Really, we went off the gold standard in like 1913 or whatever, when the Federal Reserve was created. And then finally, right before World War II, 33 or something like that. But officially, Nixon closed the gold window. And tell me when it's up.
It's up. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm blocking off in red is just what the economy looked like in terms of the change of inflation year over year under a gold standard. And this would be the same, we backed Bitcoin or something like that. You paid this. This is what it looks like when you have a constraint on the financial sector that the government has to then borrow its own currency that it's going to spend, right? It's a real capital constraint when you do this. And if we go on some sort of backed currency system, we will have, 2022 will look like a walk in the park in terms of inflation relative to what we will get under a gold standard.
So we're trying to avoid these blue downturns. Is that what
and the big red upturns? Yeah. We're trying to avoid, really what we want is stable. I agree with like the Fed policy that we want stable prices over time. 2% inflation, great. 3% inflation, great. Heck, even 4% inflation, not bad, but not exactly what we want. But yeah, why? Because it helps us all plan for our lives, right? That's all well and good. But when you have inflation consistently every decade spiking to 15, 20%, and then deflation hitting 10, 5, 10, 20%, decade after decade, every decade, they would have a Great Depression followed by a 2022 inflation. And the reason for this is because when you back a currency, you're forcing the government to have to acquire whatever it is that it's being backed by to issue new money. Otherwise, those run on the banks and the bond vigilante stuff is true, right? Like that it actually would happen. And so the way you do it, quite to the chagrin of the Austrians, is you actually just you get the government out of backing its currency, picking winners and losers, and just let it float. You let the exchange rate float, and kind of go and go from there. So yeah, if we were to back the currency, I would love it as a trader, right? Because every year, every decade, you'd get to go through just the most insane ebb and flow.
Yeah. The volatility is good for you, right?
The volatility is great, right? Lots of fun, but going to just be a terrible experience for anyone who has to live through it.
Yeah, totally.
Especially since every single one of us has only ever lived through a fiat money system, and again, I'm not trying to say everything is great, but dude, we all have. The vast majority of us all have 401ks that have done fabulously. The financial reality is we're all better off, even in real terms, than we are. I am not trying to say distributionally, the top has gotten more than their fair share or anything like that. It's not my argument, or that there hasn't been turns of events that have happened domestically because of policy that haven't, really panned out for everyone. But overall, in real terms, we're far better off than we ever were under a gold standard or Bitcoin or anything like that. I mean, what
is your take on the K-shaped economy that people talk about, where there's just most of the spending is being driven by people who have money, and there's a huge amount of people who have nothing that nobody's even thinking about?
Yeah, and this is, a lot of this just boils down to a policy decision, but it's hard to get out of this because we've created an incentive structure to save and risk assets, right? I mean, we all get massive tax incentives to pack our 401ks. Well, even if the government gives Social Security out and they double Social Security, that's still just going to increase the profit of McDonald's or Walmart or wherever, right? Wherever you're going to go buy, and that's just going to raise their stock, right? So it is it's a direct funnel from. It's a direct funnel from income earners, we'll call these Social Security, to asset owners, right? There's a direct funnel there, and that creates this K-shaped economy where the wealthiest just keep getting wealthier, and that creates a scenario where those who would like to save in assets and generate wealth off those assets can't, because those assets just continue to raise in price.
Right.
If it's something you don't like, and that's a policy you don't like, you just stop incentivizing the massive savings in assets, right? You get rid of the tax benefits to 401ks, you get rid of tax benefits to saving assets.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, no one's going to want to do that. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, we and people complain about this, but you're going to end up voting for the system that is here. No one actually wants to change. No one actually wants to change. I don't see anyone voting against the 401k system, but or there's just the massive tax incentive structure to save and risk assets. We love it too much.
So we're going to start doing regular MMT streams now with Brian super chatting us.
I know, apparently. Brian, thanks so much. $100. Look at this.
I'm going to start streaming again, Brian. Join up on MMT. Hit me up over there, man.
Brian says, is your argument that sustained GDP growth only comes from the government? I agree the government debt pushes up GDP, but it's nothing special in and of itself, and I don't agree with framing that government debt makes healthy growth with no real risk on the debt load.
No, my argument is not GDP is not solely the equation for GDP is not solely a calculus of fiscal, but fiscal absolutely adds to GDP growth. What fiscal does is it adds net profit to the system. Read the Levy-Kalecki profit. If you search for Levy-Kalecki, where profits come from, there's a PDF. Read through it, or pop it into AI. Just have it summarized for you, and you can work through the math this way. But when the government spends, that adds profits to the private sector.
Even if it's wasteful spending, right? Because sooner or later that spending ends up in corporate profits, right? They buy some ridiculous monument, right? They pay to build some ridiculous monument that is like a just total wasted investment. That money goes to the monument makers. Those people spend it on iPhones and cars and all kinds of things that aren't a waste of the money, right?
Yeah, I mean, think of it this way. I mean, I'm sure we're all for the new ballroom being built, going to be the most beautiful ballroom ever built.
Of course.
It's going to be a great thing. Well, whoever the hell's building that ballroom, I'm sure they have no connection to the Trump family whatsoever. I'm sure this is just an honest bid out there from.
Well, he's paying for it directly, so
he's paying it. Oh, bummer. Bad.
Well,
example.
that's what he says.
Okay.
But
okay. Just like Mexico paid for the wall. Either way, the government spends something, and you're absolutely right. Now think about it like in one of two ways. If you are the company that got the contract to do the ballroom, and the Treasury is going to ultimately pay for that, right? Just in this instance, if that is the case, then you're now more profitable. People see that this is a profitable endeavor. The private sector as a whole in aggregate is now more profitable, and so they're this is kind of Minsky. This is Minsky and Goodwin are two of the economists who kind of put together this theory that means more investment gets created. And there's absolutely a causal correlation link there, where more profits create more investment, right? So it goes profits then investment. And so I'm all for the investment side, but that investment side cannot get kicked off unless profits enter the system. And the reason that we always get a big boom after a major recession is because the federal government spending ramps up for the automatic stabilizers, unemployment, that sort of thing hits. They do big spending packages, stimulus to get the government going. And those become the profit layer for the private sector to now want to create investment themselves. And that is what I want. I know that the government is not going to create a cooler and better GPU, right? Like right. I know whatever the government is going to create is going to be, they have, they can't go out of business with whatever they create. Now that doesn't mean though that they can't have great discoveries. NASA does a lot of good things. We should absolutely be spending money on universities, NASA, to do what would be relatively, 9 times out of 10, very wasteful type science and spending for that 1 time out of 10 where it actually comes out. But in terms of me, the consumer, stuff I actually want to use day in and day out, they're not going to create that. They're always going to make the worst version of it. I want the private sector with the private motive in hand, with the risk of failing, but the reward of massive profits as a benefit, to be taking the risk in doing that. And then I also want the capital destruction to occur, right? At some point, if no one buys a Tesla and they've said, okay, we're just done with this, that company should go under, right?
Of course,
we should let someone come in and give it a better shot, right?
Yeah.
And the government admittedly can't do that. Like definitionally, they get into a long-term contracts and they just are stuck making a bad whatever it is whenever they get into that, right? Now, there might be instances where we actually want the government to do that, right? Like you're not going to get, I'm fine with like the U.S. mail, right? Like that's whatever. We have a relatively cheap, subsidized way to send a message, right? Or, there are things that maybe we want the government to subsidize, but, just realize that the minute you subsidize something, you're unlikely to get innovation, because the government can always come in, outbid the next person and win in that sector. So you got to do it carefully. I'm not saying that I want to just subsidize everything. Absolutely not. I mean, all things being equal, let's not subsidize. Let's be very careful. I think like Australia subsidized their internet like 10, 15 years ago, right when broadband was coming on board, and everyone got stuck with like 15 megs or something. And it took a long time to get some of the faster broadband cable internet to come around. So I mean, you can really if you try and yeah, if you try and subsidize things where innovation is occurring, you can just get yourself stuck in a rut, because you're no longer adding the profit into the private sector to do so. So again, Brian, really, really good question. Read the Levy-Kalecki paper if it interests you at all. But the point is, government spending, where it's really important, is it adds that first profit layer that then the rest of the private sector can leverage from. And then also too, when you get in the financial sector, it's adding safe assets for the financial sector. And when you start slowing the pace, lowering the amount of safe assets in the private sector has to create something to become those safe assets. And so in 2008, or leading up to the great financial crisis, what they did, because government spending was so low at that time, what they were doing is they were adding mortgage-backed securities as their safe asset, as part of their safe asset layer, right? Because the supply of treasuries was just so low, and the supply of treasuries is low because government spending is low. So when there's a shortage of safe assets, the financial sector takes things that were not safe assets and brings them in as safe assets. And when that happens, when you have something an asset that is susceptible to lower it in
Market
price, you
fluctuations,
create,
yeah.
to market fluctuations, you actually you have a much stronger solvency risk than you would if you were using something that is a safe asset that is also easily purchasable by the government itself, right? The central bank can always come in and buy treasuries. We had to get a congressional change to buy mortgage-backed securities. There are a lot of benefits for the private sector for ample government, from ample government spending.
A couple more super chats, and I have to go, so we should wrap up.
Yes. Electro the Gamer for $5 says, I worded my super chat poorly. What I meant to say, Sitch, is a video I sent you about Trump's failed assassination. I have not watched that video either, but I will check it out.
And then one more. I see one more super chat you missed.
Sammy, well, there's a couple more. Sammy G, thanks so much for the $5. Sammy G says, but can MMT help me get a dog?
Oh!
Because then maybe I listen more. LOL. JK.
Uh-oh, someone wants a dog.
There you go.
That would be
Righteous
rough.
Righteous Indifference for $2 says, bring back abundance, reinstate supersizing. True. Philip Cogans for $2 says, the petrodollar has been under attack since 9/11. Our Hilts Hurt for $2 says, MPreg greater than MMT. Wow.
Oh, I forgot about that one.
Debatable. I think I would disagree with that. Goro Sero for $5 says, it seems today that all you see on Sitch and Adam show is a live newsfeed, but where are the bad video essays on which we used to rely? Well, what do you mean? We covered Hassan's terrible interview on Sunday. Doesn't that count as a bad video essay? Okay. I know what you want. You want us to cover that horrible Crimes New Roman, don't you? That everyone's been talking about. Maybe. We'll see. And Girls Are for another $5 says, also, Sitch, how much would it take for you to name your child Satanus Luciferius G? You're taking the last name right. $0. There's zero amount of money you could. Well, I shouldn't say $0.
Yeah, I was going to say, what?
There's no amount of money that you could pay me for me to name my potential future child Satanus Luciferius G. So sorry, girl. Sorry, Goro. Sorry, Sammy. We're not going that direction. Anyways.
Well, Douglas, this was fascinating. Yeah. So
thanks for having me on. It was a good chat.
Thanks for you understand this stuff way better than I do. So I think I always learn something when I watch your videos, and one day I will figure it all out. So
one day.
Yes.
You're getting close. You're getting close. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Have a good rest of your day, gentlemen.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Take care.